Our first panelist is Lucy Coassin, who is a Senior Director of Pharma Partnership at Current Health. Lucy will be joined by Josh Goldsmith, who is the General Manager of Q2's Lab Solutions, which functions as a global clinical trials laboratory. Our third panelist is Theresa Caban, who is the Director of Clinical Trials and Industry Contracts at in the Office of Research Administration at the Lundquist Institute for Biomedical Innovation. Also joining the discussion today is Ted Barduson, who is the co-founder and CEO or COO of MedVector. And our fifth and final panelist is Wout Brusselaers, who is the founder and CEO of Deep6 AI. Moderating this very important discussion is Amit Rushi, who is currently the Chief Commercial Officer at Bodyport. So with that, I leave it to Amit. Lucy, you can just pass this through.
All right, how's everyone doing? Good, good. Don't get that post-lunch coma, all right? Just to add a little more introduction to what each of our roles are at our respective organizations, could you give a short additional intro?
Sure. I'm Theresa Caban. I'm the Director of Clinical Trials at the Lundquist Institute in Torrance, California. I have been in research for about 24 and a half years now, working in research administration, everything from federal, international collaborations to in-house investigator-initiated studies, clinical trials is currently my focus now, but I have a very, very diverse background in industry relationships and federal relationships as well when it comes to initiating research.
Hi everybody, my name is Wout. I'm the founder and CEO of Deep6 AI, and we build AI-enabled software to accelerate clinical trials. I do not have an illustrious background in clinical research like other people. I'm a bit of a misfit. I was a diplomat, I have a background in philosophy and mathematics, and I run an extreme sports company, so that makes me very qualified to be on this panel.
Hi everyone, I'm the General Manager of America's Central Labs for Q2. We're a central lab, a global company with about 60,000 employees all over the world, and I oversee our labs in Valencia, in Marietta, Georgia, and in South America, and appreciate the opportunity to be here today.
And I am Ted Barduson. I'm co-founder and COO of a company called MedVector, and what we do is try to make it a little bit easier for our community physicians to host clinical trials. Prior to this, I was COO of a multi-specialty network. It was about 4,000 doctors, and an MSO that was about 1,000 doctors.
Hi, I'm Lucy Coassin. I actually have a degree in chemistry from Duke University. I started in the lab at Duke doing undergraduate research on G-protein couple receptors in Robert Lefkowitz's lab. I joined what was Invitrogen after college, and then that company quickly merged with Applied Biosystems and became Life Technologies, and then was purchased by Thermo Fisher. I then went to business school. After that, I joined the startup world for a translational oncology company, and then a digital health and decentralized clinical trial company, and now I work at Current Health. So now still in the clinical innovation space. So you can go from the chemistry lab all the way into clinical innovation and clinical trials and get closer and closer to the patient, and it's a very exciting ride the entire time. I currently am Senior Director of Pharma Partnerships at Current Health, which means that I lead all of our pharmaceutical relationships and get our product implemented into clinical studies at pharma and biotech.
Very good. Amit Rushi spent a couple decades across the healthcare ecosystem, payer side, pharma side, biotech, pharma, medical devices, decentralized clinical trials, startups the last 5 years, and very excited to be working at Bodyport, leading commercial function as we bring our digital therapeutic to the heart failure space. We got a great assembly of perspectives here, and we're going to kick it off with this key question here, thing called COVID. It's impacted the general public's understanding of clinical trials. It's impacted clinical trial study design. execution, et cetera. Just want to start talking about, well, what can you add about your perspective on how COVID has impacted the way we look at trials? Ted, want to start with you?
Sure. I think that one of the things that we forget sometimes is that the world portfolio of medicine was really impacted back, in spring of last year. Right around the time I think David Whelan came on as CEO here, it was tied to that, and they really put together some of the issues with our drugs and trying to get them through the trial process. There was a whole group of folks that were not, because of lockdown, able to go in. People were not willing to be involved in trials. And so there was a real possibility that our new drug supply was going to be impacted by this disease in a very negative way, stopping trials, at worst case, pushing them out a couple years. And so I think that one of the things that I saw with this pandemic is the creativity and energy of the market, because pharma, CROs, research sites, doctors, patients, all needed to adapt to that process, and really brought forward some of the things around decentralized trials, brought forward this little thing called telemedicine. All these things have been available for a while, but because of the pandemic, all of a sudden this was a real focus for the industry. So I think it really showed some of our energy, but it also highlighted a big issue, and that is we need to do a better job engaging our community physicians. We need to do a better job with that most trusted relationship, and that's the relationship between our doctor and ourselves, right? I mean, that's the relationship that's going to really move the needle with participation.
That's a good perspective. Theresa, with the Lundquist Institute, what can you add to that?
Well, I can tell you this. The nature of the way clinical trial business is being done, and I say business because it is a business. I want to remind all of you that it's not an extension of your practice necessarily, right? It is a business, and it should be approached as such. Now, given that, the nature of the way we do clinical trials has changed dramatically, even from 2018 to today. And that is simply because of the pandemic, right? It forced us to really look at the process and make some dramatic changes to that process, such that we could speed everything up. Like you could say, oh, okay, here's a clinical trial we want to do, and of course we got to negotiate the contract, we've got to negotiate budget, and that used to take upwards of 90, 120 days, so you're 4 months in, it takes 3 to 4 months to start a trial. I mean, it's a year before you even got a patient in, right? Not anymore. Surprise, surprise, we're looking at 30 days turnaround execution for a contract and budget. Swear to God, and it's happening, which shocks me to no end.
Wait a second, Theresa, you're saying from the idea of a study to getting it contracted?
To get a contract, so let's say you've got your protocol, and it's semifinal. It may not be final, but it's semifinal, enough to contract on and negotiate and do a budget. The expectation is you're going to get that done within 60 days from that part to contract signature to initiation.
That's exciting.
That is exciting. It's crazy exciting. The other thing, so the whole timeline is shifted, right? Which is unbelievable. I never thought I'd see the day, hand to God. I really didn't. The other thing that's interesting is the elements of the process that can be 100% virtual. No longer are the days where you have to have monitors come in and spend 18, 16, 22 hours with your staff who are now not doing the clinical trial, but sitting there pulling documents for people, right? Those days are gone too. Woohoo! That means, it's huge, because that means you can bring in more patients, you can be more timely in your discoveries, right? The things that we're looking at are 100% directly impacted by these technologies. And the future of clinical trials is aiming to continue that process. So you can keep your eyes and ears open for more of these technology uses. Telehealth, I remember 6, 7 years ago, we were doing research on how to implement telehealth. And here we are doing it as if it's nothing. You know, that's crazy. But that's how fast technology can be implemented within the research flow. And I say all of this because it's so important to recognize that and gear your mind and mindset for that for the future, because that's where it's going, hands down.
This is really exciting to hear. I mean, just the speed with which everything's been catalyzed due to the pandemic, but the technology's been there for a while. You know, Lucy, Current Health. Certainly, I can hand this mic over to her. Fine, take your own mic. This is mine. But share with us your perspective on Current Health pre-COVID and post-COVID. You know, did you get more receptivity all of a sudden, even during the time of COVID?
So I guess a little bit of background on Current Health. Current Health is a Edinburgh-based company that developed a continuous vitals biosensor and connected device software platform for remote clinical monitoring of specifically high acuity patients. So post-op oncology patients, COPD, chronic heart failure, and COVID. So this technology was being adopted at a very, very slow pace across hospitals in the United States and the UK pre-COVID, but really Current Health is so new that they were just barely commercial when COVID started. And then came to the forefront COVID, and all of these hospitals are realizing that they're completely inundated with patients, and they really need patients to be home and be able to be safely monitored from home for deterioration to determine if they actually need to be in the hospital or they can just stay and recover better from the home. And I think that, COVID was a game changer for a lot of companies because of the requirement to stop thinking about adopting new innovation and just adopt it and then, work out all the kinks later on. And we saw that across the board with our technology. It got implemented in hospital-at-home programs across the UK, across the US, and then really was a reason that hospitals were able to monitor significantly more patients than they would have been able to without this technology safely. You're talking about, ICUs that are just inundated with individuals, many of whom need to be there, a lot of whom don't necessarily in other parts of the hospital, and those people can recover safely from home, but how do you determine if somebody actually needs to be moved into critical care or not? And you can determine that with a biosensor remotely, but we weren't using this in clinical care really predominantly before in a remote setting, only in a hospital setting. So that was a huge ground shift. Current Health, because of COVID, then was able to implement that same technology in decentralized clinical trials, which obviously also were widely accelerated during COVID. It's the same thing that everyone was talking about before. None of the technology is new necessarily, it's the adoption of the technology. So Current Health this week was acquired by Best Buy Health. And Best Buy, not necessarily a company that people associate with healthcare necessarily or digital health.
Not yet.
Not yet. But they've been making some big plays. And I think that the future is bringing better care into the individual's home, making healthcare more commercialized and consumerized, and making it really more accessible to everyone, making healthcare more inclusive. So I think that if you look at the fact that Best Buy has 70% of Americans live within 15 minutes of a Best Buy store. This is a huge opportunity to bring better healthcare and better technology closer to consumers and meet people where they are and be able to, do something like a telemedicine visit from your TV that's set up by the Geek Squad and not have to go into the doctor's office because you didn't necessarily need to in the first place. So these are all things that people would have probably laughed at 5 years ago. Telemedicine was very slow to get adopted. Going to getting primary care at CVS, things like that, were all things that were just too futurized for people 5 years ago, but now everyone's like, oh yeah, of course that's gonna be widely adopted in a couple years.
Well, the COVID-driven mind shift is happening quickly.
Yeah.
Wout, Josh, can you add your perspectives, especially Q2 solutions? A lot of that shift you're seeing, you manage these labs. I made that drive from Valencia. Took a little bit longer than expected. But you've got these facilities everywhere nationwide. And Wout, with what you've built at Deep Six and how you've been seeing its expansion during COVID and what you're seeing as that impact of that mind shift of your customers, can you both share that?
Yeah, sure. And I can't emphasize the impact COVID's had on our operation. And overall, it's been just, frankly, a giant headache for everyone to a point where we're actually, burning a lot of people out. Everyone's heard about the Great Resignation, and we're seeing just enormous change in our industry. So you start with the employees. They're going through their own changes. We had hundreds of employees that were working in the office every day that, with the flip of a switch, now work from home. There were all kinds of cultural, technology, communication things related to that. I wasn't very good at Teams 2 years ago, and now I love it. I can't live without it. And then you look at just the impact to the business and to the operation overall. So we're a very high throughput operation. We have 6,000 shipments arrive every week. We have about 20,000 samples we bring into our system every week. And so those samples are collected from physicians' offices, and as Ted said, they all closed. So all of a sudden, we saw a real dramatic decrease in the opening of doctors, and then visits went way down, and we stopped receiving, or samples came way down in terms of the volume. So now you've got people standing around in the lab, and so you've got to decide what to do about that, because everyone in the beginning said this was going to be 2 weeks, right? We're all going to go quarantine for 2 weeks, and then we'll all go back to normal. So that went on for another 2 weeks and another 2 months, and then it's gone on and on. So we've had to adjust our operation considerably around that. Things are starting to return now, but they're not really coming back to normal, and I think a lot of it is related to some of the changes we're talking about today. But there's fundamental changes going on still. So for example, flights have changed, logistics have changed dramatically globally. So for example, where we could get samples in from South America in 48 hours, it now takes 72 hours or longer. And a lot of those tests we're running are out of stability by the time they arrive. So we've had to open up the lab, keep the lab open longer, work with our airline partners to try to route samples in differently. Supply chains, everyone's here talking about supply chains. We have days where we don't have enough tubes, where we don't have enough reagents, where we're shipping reagents from Scotland into California so we can finish the day's run. So lots of inefficiencies around that. So each of these things has driven innovation, and each of these things has driven kind of different ways to work. And the way that I'm describing to our team now is this is the new normal. This is not like gonna end at some point. This is pretty much how we're gonna operate for the next few years. And I think that's in some ways a good thing, because I think we're seeing a lot of innovation, and we're going to talk more about it today, that's really driving the industry. And so looking forward to talking more about that today.
All right, thanks. Face it, nobody here in the room is going to buy our software, so I'm not going to talk much about us. I'm going to talk a little more about what I believe I see as the trends. What I think we've seen is that there's a central paradox, right, in clinical trials. Clinical trials are a compromise. In a way, it's like it's a tenuous relationship between sponsors and pharma companies trying to get new drugs to market faster, right? So they want to innovate, and health systems that are often the one that are providing care to us, right, and to every patient, saying, take it a little bit easier, let's make sure that everything we bring to market is safe and make sure that it works, right? And this is kind of unique to healthcare. In many other things, you can get software, other products out there without much of that testing, right? So this uneasy relationship that existed for a long time, and because you have multiple parties with different incentives in there, clinical trials haven't really innovated as much as they should have. They were kind of honestly still, I mean, I wouldn't say 19th century, but definitely 20th century. They were not really using much of the technology that we know has been around for a long time. And what I think has changed now, yes, technology has been around, but what really has changed is the insight for many health systems that the economics are fundamentally changing. Because yes, you can actually apply technology, but why wouldn't you have done this before, right? COVID is a forcing function, yes, but COVID, there's so many patients everywhere, it's not that hard to find patients for a clinical trial for COVID, right? It's not like another study. It's kind of its own thing for a while, because it's so prevalent and it gets so much attention. What I think is driving more long-lasting change is the fact that also because of COVID, health systems have suffered a lot financially. When patients are afraid of being infected, when they are around other people, they don't go to health systems. They don't go to their doctors, they don't go to their appointments. They will postpone getting their hips and knees and their elbows fixed, right, and replaced. And that's where most health systems make their money. And especially in the US, As a foreigner, I can say that, I hope. Our health economics are really still fee for service. So health systems make money from providing care to patients. And the implicit contract there is that the money that I make in excess of taking care of my patients, the surplus money I'm making on care, I'm going to invest in research. So we can actually take that money, but research itself is kind of like a weaker sibling, right? And we will subsidize it, but we don't really have many expectations. We know that there are some intangibles that are good for us. It's good for a reputation. We can attract talent. It's good for our pharma relationships, etc. But it's not really our main business. We see it as kind of an annex, and I'm not sure if you agree, Theresa.
No, I do, and especially when you're talking about certain hospital entities, that's exactly the mindset.
Yep.
100%.
But now the economics are changing, and suddenly you've seen all of these health systems that are no longer actually getting their hips and knees replacement, right? They're suffering because patients are not coming in, so the care money is not coming in. What you're seeing suddenly is lots of M&A activity, health systems buying each other up and trying to go to scale to outsource that, right? But secondly, for the first time, what I think they're really doing is they're rethinking both their care delivery, and they're thinking, well, if care is going to become cheaper, because we cannot charge as much for a televisit as we can now, right? We have to think about how we're going to do this. Can we find a way for clinical research to stand on its own? Can we turn this into more of a business unit that actually has to obey its own economics rather than subsidizing with the rest? And that is what we've seen as the biggest change. Health systems that will not adopt technology because, like, yeah, it's research. You know, yeah, we'll put stuff in there. Who cares if 45 medical interns have to spend 18-hour days to kind of transcribe data from a health system? Who really cares, right? It's free money for us. And now that is changing. I think they're seeing the relationship with pharma, they're seeing the relationship with government as an opportunity for them to bring in new revenues. And they see that they actually have to become more cost conscious. So that to me is kind of the big impact from COVID.
Yeah, I appreciate that perspective. It's a good bridge to this next question. Traditionally, we all know difficulty, study startup activities, first patient in, last patient in. When, you know, it could take you like 3-4 years to get that phase 2 trial done. Things get accelerated in a decentralized virtual environment. Things can get accelerated because the opportunity of reaching so many patients willing to contribute to research, given the focus of healthcare delivery organizations, et cetera. Are you seeing, in all your organization's experience, are you seeing the ability to generate, more easily generate evidence, real world evidence, that health plans are more interested in, to see that, hey, an outcome from a trial is gonna be more reproducible in the real world, or that underrepresented patient population is now more reachable in this trial because of everything that's been manifesting the last 18 months?
Well, I can say this. I think that is what people want to see. Do I think we're going to get there really quickly? No. Honest. Sorry. But I think the mindset is changing. And you know, change is a slow process, especially in medicine, and especially when we're talking about disparities in medicine. Sorry about it, folks, but yep, it exists, it's real, and it continues all the time, every day. Why? Because it's not a conscious thing. We don't consciously think that, oh, we should really reach out to this specific population. I happen to work at a hospital, or with a hospital as a partner that's in a part of Southern California that has a community of people that are often disparaged, that don't have access, that are poor, that are on the fringe of society, but they have health issues, they need to be treated. And it's important that research consider process. You know, yeah, great for innovation, great for all these great finds and cures and everything else, but how are you going to deliver it? Right? We can't forget about that process. And it's so important, and that too is changing. I know at my previous employer, that was our focus, 110%. Why? Because we only did, we were the master of data. Maybe you can figure out where I worked before, but that's pretty much what we did, was we had data. Huge data collector. I worked for a hospital that was its own insurer. Okay, clue. That was the clue. But yes, absolutely 100%. The last 2 years, the focus of their research has been innovating patient to patient bedside. What are we doing? How are we doing this? How are we going to do it? And focus in such a way that we can bring it back to the home, right? And it's a process. That process, because it requires us to change how we think, is going to take a bit more time.
Well, based on what you're saying there, Theresa, and for all the panels, just want to add this as you consider some of your responses. When you look at drugs, digital therapeutics, medical devices, combinations, and the impact of adopting technology during COVID, are you seeing what Theresa's saying as providing more opportunity to reduce or mitigate this lack of reaching these populations and these disparities in healthcare?
So first, I just want to say I agree completely with everything that you said, 100%. And I think that that's a very sort of realist approach, especially in terms of are we sort of going to see the same level of acceleration for future trials? Change takes a long time. It's hard. I think that's actually an opportunity for every single person in this room. I think that scientists, people with medical backgrounds, people that work in clinical research, at least what I saw with COVID, there's sort of an onus on you to help be a part of the solution and be an educator to your family, your friends, the people that you talk to all the time. I literally went to dinner with a good friend last night who used the term guinea pig when we were talking about what I do for work, and I think we're trying to get away from that language. I'm actually, several of the people that I worked with at Science 37 participated in the COVID-19 vaccine studies, and I was kicking myself. I didn't even think of that as an option. And then, of course, they were vaccinated way before everybody else was, and I was like, why didn't I think of that? So I think that there's a huge opportunity for better education to reach more individuals and to create better health equity, but I also think that many digital health companies, Current Health included, Science 37 included, are thinking about how to be more inclusive and reach harder to reach populations. That's part of the importance of decentralizing clinical research, but even in the individual products, thinking about people that don't necessarily have Wi-Fi at their house, how do you make something easy for somebody to use when they're not used to using a smartphone constantly? How do you reach across the digital divide? These are all things that digital health companies are constantly thinking about, because if you have digital tools to serve health, it doesn't actually do anyone any good if people aren't using them. So I think you see this pendulum shift with adoption of the technology, and I think it's probably going to go a little bit the other direction, because we're figuring out that we can give all this technology out to participants or to sponsors or to sites, and if they don't use it because they don't understand how to use it, or they don't want to, or they couldn't get it to turn on, now that's an even bigger problem because we've invested the money. And I think that it's just going to require time, education, and support, and really everyone working together to get through that piece of it and get the technology actually used so that it can serve its purpose.
The other thing, and can't agree more. The other thing, when you think about diversity and inclusion, it really comes down to trust. That's what it comes down to. And if you want to have more inclusion, and you want to reach out to those groups that are diverse and not engaged in clinical trials, you have to increase that trust. And so I think one of the things, and actually the FDA Commissioner Janet Woodcock just came out in the New England Journal of Medicine, and she said that we have a lot of technology that's out there that can really help us with what we're trying to achieve, but we have to engage the community physicians, because the most trusted relationship that exists out there today is that between your doctor and yourself. And if you're going to change your treatment, if you're going to change the drug you're on, you're not going to do that because you saw a Facebook ad. It's just not going to happen. And so I think that's where part of the energy of what we need to do here with clinical trials is to really lean in on that relationship that exists out there.
I was just going to say, so I agree with you for a particular patient population, but how do you think about the younger generations that don't have primary care physicians, really?
Yeah, actually, that's an interesting segue, because I was just going to say, I think this period we're in is really unique in terms of just the awareness of clinical trials and the awareness of clinical development. I mean, 2 years ago, unless you were a stock market nerd or a science nerd, you weren't really waiting for the results of many clinical trials, right? Now we've got people basically, millions of people waiting to find out when their children can be vaccinated, when their brothers can get vaccinated. So I think that's created a lot more awareness of just the whole notion of clinical development. And I think we also have to look kind of outside of the box when we think about enrollment, we think about clinical trials. Prior to my current job, I ran all the genotyping for 23andMe, the personal consumer genomics company. And they have millions of people now in their database of all kinds of ethnic groups, and a very diverse database that they're actually mining. And you can argue, there's issues with that from a personal information standpoint, but they're mining those data and they're generating new discoveries from that. And that didn't involve anyone necessarily going to a physician's office. So there's kind of different ways, I think, to think about clinical trials in the future that we need to kind of brainstorm.
Yeah. What I think is maybe an important part as well, if you think about the future of clinical trials, is the fact that we've been conducting an experiment for the last 10 years in digitizing all of our healthcare data. And the problem is that normally when you think about big data, it means that you have a big denominator, right? You have data that you can benchmark everybody against. Again, because of some fundamental decisions made, what we had instead here was like little data, locked and fragmented in individual EMR systems, but they don't talk to each other. But at the same time, there's a lot of little data, right? More than 300 million patients in the US, more than 3 billion patients worldwide, we have digital health information. So what has been happening to some extent, despite us really paying attention, is you're building a collective medical intelligence. And the great thing about it is for every patient that has something happen to them, there's potentially 3 billion other patients you can benchmark them against. So what you can really start doing is thinking, well, clinical research never stops. Everything I do is a live experiment. Everything that happens, right? If you merge the data from clinical trials with the health economic outcomes data and with the population health data and with just the care data, right? Whether it's N of 1 for rare diseases or everything else, you have now the technology with big data providing you the denominator, right? And with AI giving you the ability actually to pick the numerator. That's what AI really does, right? Pattern matching. This patient is like this, so compared to these patients, right? You build these vectors. I think that's a huge opportunity. And I think that's going to drive a lot of how we're doing clinical trials. Most people are really thinking still about the old-fashioned clinical trials. Have to deliver a service to a patient doing this and that, but pretty soon a lot of that will go away because every time you actually take a pill, every time you see a physician, every time you do something, you work out and you have some data tracking, that is going to be part of clinical research.
That is a very interesting point, gets into this last bucket I want to dig into. Really the title of our panel here, The Future of Clinical Trials. So while what you were talking about, it's almost as if you could take that and say, maybe there's not a new molecule to develop necessarily. It's actually determining what's the best practice for many more cohorts of types of people with what types of conditions. You can learn the optimization of that management and the monitoring thereafter and continual management. On the other hand, we can look at combination opportunities, mental health apps plus a drug, a molecule, an implant, drug, and a software app, et cetera. So as we come out of COVID, we, see more folks, and Josh was saying, many more families being more aware of clinical trials, awaiting results, and younger generations being more willing to go to non-traditional medical experts. We see CVS Health, Walgreens, Boots Alliance, and Walmart, et cetera. The pharmacist has always been seen much more by a patient than any physician. What do you think future of clinical research at large will be, and what kind of solutions will actually get commercialized? There's one thing to say for advancement of science, but let's translate things into medical practice. So, any kind of final thoughts you want to add to this?
Just make a quick comment. You mentioned apps and devices and drugs, but historically one of the hallmarks has been diagnostics and drugs and developing kind of companion diagnostics. And I think COVID has just completely revolutionized that. Not that you've got a companion diagnostics here, but how many of you went to a third-party testing site 2 years ago to get a test for something? No, none of us, right? We would go to our doctor, we'd go to Quest, we would go to LabCorp. Over the last 2 years, I bet everyone in this room at least 2 or 3 times has gone to some satellite place and got a test.
Or something mailed to your home.
Or some, and that was the next thing I was going to say exactly, is a great point, is so, or mail, now a lot of people, my friends, they just have the Binax packs at home. So this whole concept of just having diagnostics in your house now isn't that unusual. That's going to revolutionize things over the next 50 years, because basically now you've got a platform where you can roll out all kinds of other things for cancer, for infectious diseases, for a whole variety of diseases. So I think that really kind of lays the groundwork for some interesting things.
Maybe I'll just add one more thing. The first thing I said was talk about the shifts in economics in healthcare, and the second thing about datafication. And to your point, those two are obviously merging, right? Who are going to be the big health companies of the future? Is it going to be Google, Amazon? Is it going to be Best Buy? All the people that have data, that have sensors that can kind of connect all of this, right? They can buy all the rest. And again, it's that they have a different approach to that central paradox of innovation in healthcare. They use data, they want to move fast, right? We have pharma companies want to do the same thing, but we have health providers want to move slow, because the health of their patients for such a long time has been so important, and they want to kind of guard it callously, right? They want to make sure that nothing happens there. And now we're kind of, again, going through this shift where we're making changes, and we're doing new things actually much faster than ever before. And we're just, in a way, looking at the data at a much higher level. And there's a danger to that, right? Which, of course, if you look at all the data, if some of these things backfire for one or two patients, you don't care as much, versus if you are the physician, it's one of your patients, you care a lot.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying that there's no risk around that, but I believe if you think about the future of healthcare and research as a whole, it's going to be that merger of all of these data companies and these other companies who know a lot more about other types of innovation, who are going to come into healthcare and play more there.
It's already happening. It's already happening. Look, Google, I'm just saying it's already happening. I can't say much more than that, but I know it's already happening.
There's a lot out there with Google already. Yep, they're doing quite a bit.
Right, and there's always an app for it, because just in process, I just want to, because data is a huge thing. And I want to talk a little bit about the legalities around data management, because that's also the future of part of what you would potentially be
Theresa, you got to bring the lawyers into this?
Yeah, might have to bring a little lawyer. So you should know one on speed dial, just in case. I'm just saying. But yeah, there are a lot of laws already in place. There's GCP, there's CCCP. That's California, by the way, has its own data law, in case you didn't know, right? We have the European data law, and each state, that could be 50 more, laws regarding how data can be used. So if you're going to be engaged in data in research, you need to get to know one. I'm just saying, be prepared, because there could be a tremendous amount of red tape. Sounds super easy. We're just going to grab this data from here, and this data from here, and this data from over here. And by the way, I don't know if you're from Europe or not, but we're going to grab that data too. Right? Because that's how Google's thinking. Mm-hmm. But you got to make sure that you understand those laws that are revolving around, let me have this, let me have that, let me have that. And by the way, if you're working in any of the, you're protecting that, right? You got to protect your patient's data too, because of course there are laws revolved around that. Yep. So although the ideas sound so easy, in practice, they can be super complicated. So when you're thinking big picture, don't forget that grain of sand that you got to pay attention to make it actually work. That's key.
Good point.
You know, I think that one of the pieces, certainly data and being able to find the right patient for a clinical trial is going to be absolutely required. Certainly technology so that we can utilize telemedicine and utilize wearables so that we're collecting as much information and having that used for clinical trials is important. But really, I think at the end of the day, it's access to those clinical trials. And how are we going to make sure that we can operationalize that? Because there's no medical mystery that when you need a participant for a clinical trial, you can find them at your doctor. You can find them at your specialist. They're there. But, you know, there's a certain serendipity to a patient finding a clinical trial. You know, they have to go to a doctor who is a PI. That doctor has to have an awareness of a clinical trial that's going to impact that particular, my particular patient issue that I have, and then get me involved in that clinical trial. And I think what we need to do is really remember that we need to make sure that there's a, how can I say this? There's a way that we're going to be able to take the information that we all have to try to make a clinical trial patient-centric and make it easy for them to be involved in trials. But really the best way to be patient-centric is to be doctor-centric. Because if we can make it easy for them to be involved in clinical trials and provide access to those clinical trials, we're going to get more folks into the process, we're going to get the drugs through the trials quicker, and we're going to be able to get the drugs to market.
Round it out.
I guess the only thing I can add to that thread is that I do think that that's something that pharma sponsors are very aware of. The idea that I heard at a recent conference was, BYOD for patients to make it patient-centric, like bring your own device, let patients be on their smartphone as in the trial. BYOT, bring your own tech for doctors' offices, so that we're stopping forcing 37 different software packages on every single site to participate in a single individual trial. I have a lot of questions on exactly where that'll go. But one thing I just wanted to touch on that was part of the question around the future and digital therapeutics and combination products. So I think anybody who's been watching or is familiar with any tech company, you know that Facebook is addictive, right? Facebook is a drug, right, essentially. So you know that if an app, a social media app, can essentially be a drug, that we could have a whole argument on whether it's good or bad or whatnot, but clearly it changes people's behavior. That the data is very clear on that. So I think that there is huge opportunity in digital therapeutics that we sort of haven't really considered fully. We've only sort of had our minds open to, let's put a pill in the body or an infusion in the body to actually have a medical change on an individual. And there is clearly ways to do that via an app as well. And I think that it's an area where pharma is actually moving a little bit slower and will probably be disrupted.
Pharma's been doing that for 20 years beyond the pill. Is that slow?
No, like an actual data.
No, I get what you're saying there, Lucy. It is interesting, digital therapeutics. I don't know what familiarity the audience has with that, but there's been an array of some state coverage, at least on the Medicare level, of notable digital therapeutic drugs, I should say. At Massachusetts, I think 3 DTX solutions were just approved, and they're being made available to the population. So there will be, in the next 3 years, probably over 20 or 30 of them. So that's absolutely on the horizon. Just to summarize some of the sentiments shared over these last few big questions we're going through, certainly there's a blend of medical practice and research. The intertwining of, you go here for your care, whether it's telehealth or in person, the greatest opportunity to leverage your data permissioned in optimizing standard of care for this type of population or offering a clinical trial and engaging you remotely or also bringing in facilities that are near your home. There's a new norm to be discovered and optimized for whatever works for each individual. And that's really exciting. And one of the things I would argue that Josh, you made sure to add this. When you're looking at innovation, it's not just the drug, it's also a diagnostic, it's also a device, it's a software as a medical device, it's any combination. There are so many new ways to innovate, and clinical trials, the operation in clinical trials is making it easier to get there, but there's still challenges out there. So I think that's really exciting. COVID has certainly manifested an acceleration on this vector, and try to take as big advantage as you can on it. And there's a lot to offer in this sector.